So the aim today is to talk a bit about the current situation on the coast of Fukushima Prefecture in Japan, particularly almost 10 years on from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. So, I mean, I don't know who's listening today. I haven't looked through the participant list, but I'd imagine that some of you will, at some point over the last few years, have heard me giving various seminars and all the rest about the situation in Fukushima. And what I want to do today is move the story on a little bit and talk about what's happening now, and to think more widely about what the longer term implications of the March 2011 events have been for daily life on the Fukushima coast. So if I can click through. So I'm going to talk about three broad things, and I'll aim to speak for about 35-40 minutes or thereabouts, and then I'll allow some time for questions afterwards. And so to start, I'll say a bit about what the current situation is with fisheries in Fukushima 9 years after the accident. And I'm then going to speak a bit about some of our very recent research from last year and from this year into how the disaster has changed. I've said they are fishers' lives, but really the lives of societies, people, communities on the coasts more widely. And then lastly, I'd like to just offer some insights into an ongoing issue around the problem of contaminated water that they have on site, and what's happening with that. So, but before I kind of get into the material, there's a number of people that I want to say thank you to. Not least, in fact, probably most importantly of all, my main collaborator, Professor Midori Kawabe from Tokyo University of Marine Science and Technology. Kawabe-sensei and I have been working together doing social science research on the Fukushima coast since 2014. Kawabe-sensei herself has been doing work with fishers, with fishing communities and fisheries cooperatives since the disaster actually happened, so it's right the way through. And we've also been very fortunate along the way to get support from a number of local organizations, from the regional government in Fukushima, from the fisheries cooperative, and some of the city governments as well. And I should say also that what I'm presenting today is material that is based on a UK-Japan Social Science and Humanities Connections grant that we have, that's been funded through the Economic and Social Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and we're very grateful for the support that is facilitated. And I wanted to show this just to really acknowledge that this is in no way a solo venture, and there's a large number of people who've greatly supported this research and continue to do so. So you should now have on your screens a map of Japan, which shows Tokyo and also shows Fukushima Prefecture, and Fukushima being the home to the nuclear plants, being one of the administrative local government regions that was hardest hit by the tsunami and the earthquake and the nuclear accident in 2011. Again, people who have heard me give this talk before will be familiar with what I'm going to say now, which is that, language and place names matter. And when we talk about Fukushima, we're actually talking about a local government, a regional government unit that is about, and I mean, we measure everything in Europe in the size of Belgium. So Fukushima is about half the size of Belgium, and it's a sizable area. And it so happens that on the coast there were two nuclear power plants on the coast that were both named after this large administrative unit. And the result of this meant that when in 2011 there was the tsunami, the earthquake, and the subsequent nuclear explosions, we thought of this as being something that affected all of Fukushima Prefecture. And this has kind of knock-on consequences for how we perceive and understand the effects of the accident on the region's marine produce. So Fukushima as an area is quite a big geographical unit. And yet, you know, we associate this whole unit with the nuclear accidents. So also, I wanted to just, at the start of the talk, give you a bit of a sense of what the fisheries and coastal landscape in Fukushima Prefecture on the Fukushima coast is like in 2020. So this is what you see here. This is the Fukushima Daiichi, the Fukushima #1 nuclear plant. And this is it. This is the situation. This photograph's actually from the year before last. But you know, as you can see, there's a lot of infrastructure has been built there. There's a lot of investment, a lot of work that's going to sort of keep this under control, I should say, and to sort of slowly decommission the plant. Nonetheless, it is there, and as I'll say later, it remains a concern for fishers, for fishing communities, and indeed for the people who live in the surrounding area. Fishing, by and large, is slowly starting to come back to the Fukushima coast. So this is the end of last year. This is Soma fishing port, one of the bigger fishing ports up in the north. Fishing tends to be more coastal, small scale. And it's also, again, worth flagging up, we talk an awful lot, or at least I talk an awful lot, about marine radiation and about the effects of radioactive contamination on the marine environment, and by extension on fish and on fisheries and on the livelihoods of fishers. But it is also worth pointing out that, you know, this area was hit by a very powerful, deadly tsunami, which caused a lot of physical infrastructural damage. And most of the fishing ports have had to be quite significantly reconstructed and rebuilt. So a lot of the fishing ports themselves, these little coastal fishing ports, look very new. And a lot of the reason for that is that there has been significant investment and work into actually rebuilding the physical infrastructure. So as well as rehabilitating fisheries post-radiation, post-nuclear accident, there's also been a need to think about the effects of the tsunami. And this is one such port. Actually, this is one of the last fishing ports to reopen. Ukedo Port in Namie is about 5 kilometers north of the nuclear plant and was under an evacuation order for 6 years. So it's only quite recently, actually, that boats have been able to come back here and fishers have been able to fish. So just as a sort of summary of what happened, for those of you who might not be familiar, and for people who might have seen this before, this perhaps repeats, but I think it's worth just reiterating. When the tsunami knocked out the cooling systems at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, triggered a series of hydrogen explosions, 70 to 80% of this contamination ended up in the Northwest Pacific Ocean. The result of this was that 40% of fish plus that were sampled shortly after the accident exceeded the regulatory threshold in Japan for radioactive cesium. 9 years on, there's a pretty good technical and scientific understanding of where that contamination is and of how it varies across space. And there is pretty good general consensus that the levels of radiation in the sea are decreasing. But, as I say, the plant itself, it is there. There are harmful substances there. There are things there that were never intended to be there. And until that is removed completely, a process that will take 30, 40 years, that is going to continue to be of concern to fishers and to fisheries cooperatives. As a result of the meltdowns and also the infrastructural damage, coastal fishing in Fukushima was restricted almost immediately. Since 2012, species have been released for trial operations at about 10 to 20% of pre-disaster levels if radioactive cesium is not detected in initial monitoring. And we're now at a stage where about 228. So nearly all, actually, of the different species that we can find and catch and eat in the Fukushima coast have been released for what are called trial operations. So about 10 to 20% of pre-disaster level, selling these on the open market to brokers, to restaurants, to wholesalers, and to the public. So the vast majority of the marine produce in Fukushima Prefecture is now, in 2020, has been judged as being safe to eat. Whether people actually will eat or not is a different matter, and there's still a difference of opinion among citizens. This here, I don't expect you to be able to read this, and I'll explain what this is. So this is on the Fukushima Regional Government website, and this is a list of all the fish species that have been released for commercial sale. The bottom right there, that little chap whose photo we have, that's Uchibori-san. He's the governor. He's the representative he's the leader of Fukushima, and he himself has taken quite a visible and proactive role in sort of putting his face out there and saying that this marine produce is not just only safe but also delicious to eat as well. It's quite interesting, I think, as a social scientist, to see how he puts his own face, his own image down there as a sort of hallmark of the safety or otherwise of the produce. But as I say, what I really want to talk about for the bulk of the seminar today is how the disaster has changed fishers' lives. And as I say, not just fishers, but actually the lives of fishing communities in general, more widely. So for the last 2 years or so, partly through the CSRC project, but also through additional funding that we've received from one of the local governments in Japan, and also additional funding from within Tokyo University of Marine Science and Technology, my collaborators and I have been doing a series of interviews and workshops with different groups of people who have an interest in the sort of future of marine produce in Fukushima. And so we've done small group discussions with groups of fishers. I've talked with cooperatives, local governments, again fishers themselves, and also the extension officers who come from the local government. And I'm going to flag something up here. I'm going to say this, and I'm going to park it, and I'm going to come back to this later, because you might have noticed in a lot of these images from the fieldwork that you might see a lot of men. There are a lot of men that appear in these meetings, in these discussion groups, in these interviews. I'm going to come back and I'm going to speak a little bit more later on about what that might say, and about how we try to address and deal with that within our research. But I just wanted to flag up for now, there is something here about gender and about who participates and whose voices are coming to the fore. Nonetheless, we've also talked with consumers, with citizens themselves in some of the fishing villages, and looking at some of the different activities that are going on to revitalise communities. And one of the areas that I want to focus on especially is a series of workshops that we ran last September collaboratively between my previous institution, Robert Gordon University, between Tokyo University of Marine Science and Technology, where Kawabe Sensei is based, and between the Fukushima Prefecture, so the regional government's Fisheries division, and their extension officers. And so what we did was we got fishers together, and I think anybody who's ever done research with fishers in any country will know what it's like, and that it can be quite challenging to get fishers to talk openly and frankly, especially when it comes to talking to people who perhaps they haven't met so much previously, or have had so much contact with. And so what we did was we worked in collaboration with the regional government and the extension officers in their fisheries division, who know the fishers very well, who speak to them very regularly. And Kawabe Sensei had worked with the extension officers, most of whom come from a natural science background, and she trained them up as covert social scientists. I say covert, I don't mean that in an ethical way. What I mean is that we have with the extension officers a group of people who understand the fishers, who know them well, whom people in fishing communities have a good relationship with and who feel confident talking with. And so we used that to facilitate a discussion with fisheries cooperative representatives, with fishers, to understand more deeply how they see some of the things that have happened in their lives over the last few years. And what I'm going to present in the next few slides is some of what we found. We got a lot of insights from that. That was a pretty painful day of work, trying to translate everything on the post-it notes first into English and then try to make sense of them. But this is what I'm basing what I'm going to talk about on. And in particular, I think one of the areas that's been quite sort of I don't want to say understudied, but hasn't received so much attention are, what are some of the informal coping strategies in fishing societies and fishing communities in Fukushima? What are some of the ways informally that people have had for understanding and for dealing with shocks and stresses? How have they used these traditionally? And how has the sort of new conditions of the disaster, how has that affected some of these traditional and quite significant practices that fishing communities have relied on? And across the course, not just of the workshops, but also the interviews that we did more broadly, a number of elements came to the fore, some of which were quite surprising and unexpected. And I'm going to just tell you a few little stories now with a bit of text on the screen to just explain what I mean by this. So one of the first things that we'd never heard, and actually the fisheries extension officers said to us afterwards that they'd never heard either, was that trial fishing, so these post-disaster, fishing now only happens in good weather. So they do these small operations at about 10%, 20% of what happened pre-disaster, but they only do this at small scales, and they only do this in good weather. So if there's storms, if there's bad weather forecast, the day's fishing is cancelled. And what the older fishers, the captains especially, had said to us was that what they found quite regrettable about this was that this meant they couldn't teach the younger generation of fishers, and to be honest, they often said their own sons, the words they used were, we can't teach our own sons, or the younger generation more widely, how to fish in storms. And that matters a lot because within Fukushima, there's different fishing districts. Up in the north, there's a fishing district called Soma, and something that traditionally has been a real sort of source of pride for the Soma fishers has been their ability to go out and fish in all weathers. So traditionally a really sort of strong hallmark, a kind of real marker of identity of being a proper Soma fisher has been this ability to go out no matter what the weather is and land a catch. That's something that has been a real source of pride for the fishers, and it's been really something that has given them their own sort of sense of identity as being a Soma fisher. And now, because of the nature of trial fishing operations, that can't happen. They can't do that anymore. And so something has been lost there that has been considered traditionally quite important for the identity and the kind of meaning of the practice of the fishers. They've lost their ability to go out and fish in storms in the way they wanted to before. Another related point is that the loss of regular fishing affects a number of aspects of daily life. So pre-disaster, when fishing was operating at full scale, fishers would be out on their boats every single day. So they'd be up at 1 in the morning, sailing out by about 2 a.m, and they would be out working on their boats every single day. Trial operations, as I say, they run at a much less frequent rate, maybe 1 or 2 times a week. And the result of that is that fishers have less time to interact with their crews and to interact with other fishers. And so what this is doing, these trial operations by necessity are smaller scale, but it's removing a big source of interaction within some of the coastal communities. And so even though you can rehabilitate physically the ports, you can rebuild boats, you can compensate fishers for loss of earnings, you can pay them to join the trial operations, what you can't bring back is the sort of regularity of contact that fishers had with each other. And that's not just being out in the boats, but it's also working together to mend nets, to make equipment. Going back to what I said in the previous slide, another thing that the fishers in Fukushima really pride themselves on is their resourcefulness, their ability to sort of make their own equipment, to mend their own nets, to do things themselves. And there are fewer opportunities now for them to interact with each other and to do that. And that also extends not just to the boats and the fishers, but also, in fact, to the whole community. Because again, and when boats came into port at the end of the morning's fishing, when they land their catch, that became historically a sort of point of interaction for the whole community. So you would have family members coming down to help. You would have people coming to help offload the boats, and while they were there, they would talk to each other. They would exchange stories. They would they would check in on each other. And so when that's removed, you're removing a kind of big source of interaction that allows people to look out for each other and to be able to support people who might need it. So that's something that the fishers have felt was, or still continues to be, missing. There are also other aspects as well to fewer fishing outings, and that is changes in fishers' practices and changes in their relations with their family. And so what came across really strongly when we started talking to the fishers, not just about radiation, but about life more widely, was that they could really sense the changes in their own bodies and in their own rhythms. And I suspect many of us will be feeling something similar at the moment with the increased sort of levels of working at home that we're all having to do. But this is something that the fishers have been experiencing for a good 8-9 years or so. So, as I said previously, when they're out fishing every day, fishing starts sailing out of port 2-3 in the morning, up at 1 a.m, out all day. Now the fishers are at home a lot more. They're spending a lot more time at home, so they're receiving compensation for loss of earnings. They continue to receive compensation for loss of earnings. But what that doesn't compensate, what that money doesn't replace or doesn't change, is the loss of daily rhythm. And so, the fishers said to us, they said, we've got a lot more time at home with our families, and they said this is not necessarily a good thing. Another thing that flagged up, and it was raised humorously, but again, there's an underlying message here about well-being. Most of the groups of fishers that we had in our workshops said, we're getting fat. They said we're putting weight on because we're not out in the boats every day, we're not out working hard, we're not out, lifting baskets, hauling nets in, we're not getting as much physical activity, and we're putting weight on as a result. And there, while that seems humorous, and while it was said in a humorous way, there is an underlying issue there about how these big disruptions can affect our daily lives in very sort of profound ways, in very sort of tangible ways, and we can feel that through our own bodies. One of the last things I wanted to say as well about some of the changes that we had, and I'm just going to skip back a couple of slides to flag up something that came out. So I don't know if you can see on this slide here at the bottom left of the screen, what we have is a table of younger fishers. And when I say younger fishers, I mean fishers that are probably in their 20s, 30s, 40s. And the disruptions, the changes that have been brought about by the nuclear accident have been particularly hard for this group of younger fishers, and indeed younger people living on the coast more widely. The reason for this is that this group who started fishing started to take up their practice in the in probably just before the disaster, so 2009, 2010 kind of time. They started just before the accident. The accident happened, fishing was suspended. So this group, they started to learn, they started to hone their skills and craft for fishing before the accident. Then they said to us, we had a big blank. 4 or 5 years, we couldn't do any fishing. Then we came back, everything was different. We had to adapt to catching different fish because some of the fish we caught before were still restricted. We had to work at different rhythms. We had to use different techniques. And then the younger fishers said they found this really hard because the fishing that they'd started to learn, the fishing that they started to know, just didn't exist anymore. And for the older fishers, it was maybe there was a blank for them too. But for fishers who had many decades of experience, the younger fishers felt that their seniors had a big bank of experience that they could draw on. They had a big bank of experience that they could draw on that could help them to adapt to post-disaster fishing. Whereas the younger fishers felt that they didn't really have this, and it put them in a kind of challenging and an awkward position. They said, we don't really know how to cope. We don't have the ability to. We don't yet have the skills. We don't have the coping strategies to be able to adapt to post-disaster fishing. So I thought that was quite interesting, because when we look at what's said about Fukushima more widely after the disaster, we talk a lot. There's a lot that's been written about older people, about the elderly. Quite rightly, you have an aging population. Elderly people are at a lot of risk of harm, and it's quite right that a lot of attention is given to that. But I thought this was quite an interesting insight as well, that actually for younger fishers it can be challenging too. So there's also, as well as the effects on fishers' lives and the immediate lives of fishers' families, there's also wider ramifications for the community. And something that really struck me this year is the activity that's happening locally to sort of create a sense of pride in the consumption of Fukushima fish. And so what you can see here is a fish shop, and you get quite a few of these around the coastal district. And what you notice outside them are these snazzy little white, blue, and red flags. And what these flags say on them, they say Joban Mono, and that's Japanese for fish that come from a specific coastal region in the south of Fukushima. And so a lot of shops now are very proudly, a lot of restaurants too, are very proudly telling people that they sell fish that are caught and landed in Fukushima waters. It's not a sort of badge of shame. It's something that they are actively promoting. They're actively marking out and celebrating the fact that they are catching and eating and trading in locally landed fish. And it's also interesting, and not just from the commercial side, but also from the public and citizen side as well, that the sort of act, the sort of performance of eating Fukushima fish for a small but select group of people has become kind of a real hallmark of being a sort of local citizen. There's a real sort of sense of, again, pride and identity that comes with consuming Fukushima fish. And you're probably thinking, why on earth are we looking at a dimly lit alley? Well, this is one of the places where Fukushima fish are mainly consumed. This is on the coast. This is the town of Iwaki in the south of Fukushima. And what they have here is called the Yoake Ichiba, which means the night market, the night opening market. And there's a number of restaurants and outlets here that will sell. And if you go on social media of a Friday, Saturday evening, and if you follow the right people, you will see a lot of Iwaki's citizens who are posting stuff online about them coming here, eating these produce, eating local fish, and celebrating that. And we can see it in a whole breadth of things, not just in social media, but also in there's some mangas as well that celebrate local Fukushima marine produce. And so an important part then, I suppose, of rehabilitating the whole area more widely is about this whole practice, this whole business, this whole act of going out, eating local seafood and showing people that you're eating the local seafood. So just for the last few minutes, there's two more points I want to make. This is one of the first ones, and this comes back to something that I raised previously. So this was January this year, January 2020, and I joined a meeting as an observer, with observer status. I joined a committee meeting on the revitalization of fisheries in Fukushima. And so this was a kind of expert committee meeting that brought together representatives of the cooperatives, it brought together local government, nuclear plant operators, academic experts. And so myself and my PhD student, Yi-Chen Huang, and our collaborator, Kawabe-sensei, were sitting at the side of the room. And Yi-Chen then pointed out to me at the side. Yi-Chen then pointed out to me, she said, "You know something, Leslie?" She said, "Me and Kawabe-sensei are the only women in this room." And she was absolutely right. We were sitting in a room of 35 men who were making decisions about which fish would be released for consumption, what prices they might try to set, and what path they might follow next. And that's that was something that, as I said before, we were aware of this, and it's something that we want to sort of look at from now on in the research. Is what does it mean when you have such a strong sort of presence of male voices in public discussions over the futures of Fukushima fish? I'm seeing a couple of questions coming in, just to say there's some really good questions, and I'll answer these at the end. So as I say, there's something interesting here that we want to kind of pick up on later about, well, what does this mean when there's such a strong male presence and male dominance, and what does that mean for what might be kind of ignored or suppressed through that? But the last thing I wanted to just talk about for the last couple of minutes is about where we are now and about what happens next. So I've talked a lot about practices linked to the seas and coasts being important coping strategies, about restrictions on fishing which limit the potential for passing on skills, and about changes in relationships with the sea, and about what some of the implications are of these for longer term coping strategies. But as I said at the start, this is not something that's finished. It's an ongoing situation. So what we can see here is from a vantage point of about 3-4 kilometers, we can see the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant. And you might notice around the fringes there that there are a large number of blue tanks. And these blue tanks store water that has been used to keep the damaged reactors cool. To keep the damaged reactors cool, to prevent them from overheating. There is a limit to how much of this water can be processed. And if you look from a satellite view, you can see that the Fukushima Daiichi site is very rapidly running out of space. So they're running out of space to store this water, which contains low levels of tritium. Some of you might be aware, some of you might not be. This water has low levels of tritium in it as an inevitable result of the process that's used to keep the reactors cool. They're running out of space, and earlier this month, an expert panel of academics recommended that this water was released into the sea off the nuclear plant. Tokyo Electric Power Company, who operates the plant, claim they will run out of space by 2022. They'll run out of space for more tanks, and that they have no other option. But the Fisheries Cooperative are very strongly opposed to releasing this water-containing tritium into the sea. Their argument being that they've worked really hard for the last 8-9 years to sort of restore the image of Fukushima fish, and that regardless of the actual safety or not, this will set any gains that they've made back. This will wipe out any gains that they might have made. So the Fisheries Cooperative are very strongly opposed to this, but other people claim that there's no other option. And internationally, there are a whole range of different views on whether this is a good thing or not. So you have Forbes saying that it's really okay if Japan dumps water into the ocean, Reuters saying water woes threaten the Fukushima cleanup, the Mainichi Shimbun in Japan saying we actually need 17 years to clean this water up properly. The Japan Times thundering that South Korea is wrong to say Fukushima tritium is harmful. And the Taipei Times in Taiwan say that Japan is accused of trying to justify a nuclear dump. So there are a whole breadth of perspectives out there on whether it is appropriate or not to release this water into the sea. Just 2 comments I'm going to make very quickly on that. First is something wonderful that I heard, and it makes me smile every time I hear it, which is, I can't remember who it was that said this to me, but if this tritium contaminated water really is safe, just release it into Tokyo Bay. If it's really safe, just send it down to Tokyo and release it into the bay there. Why not? I'm not going to comment on whether I think that's a good idea or not. I just do think it's quite an amusing way to think about the problem. The second thing just to flag up as well is that this is a situation of huge concern, but it is actually, and again this came out in some of our fieldwork, it's just one part of a much bigger picture of environmental change and pressures that are being raised on the Fukushima seas that the fishers and citizens have mentioned, including the effects of climate change on fish stocks, the effects of overfishing, and increasingly offshore wind renewable energy deployment. So there's a whole range of other pressures as well, all of which are shaping and influencing the future of fisheries in Fukushima. So just to sort of wrap up then, just in sum, from a technical and scientific point of view, we've got pretty good knowledge of the marine environment to support the gradual resumption of Fukushima fisheries. But what's much harder to assess, measure, quantify, and indeed compensate for are some of these social and cultural effects of the disaster. These are much harder to understand. You can give somebody money, you can give a fisher a salary to cover the loss of catches and lands and things like that. What you can't do is you can't replace these opportunities for interaction. You can't bring back the relations they had with their family and all the rest. That's much harder to quantify. Re-establishing these meaningful practices is important, but it's again vital to remember this is not kind of a done deal. This is not a sort of finished issue. This is an ongoing issue that is also becoming mixed in with challenges around climate change and environmental change more widely. So at that point, I will simply stop. I will thank you for your attention. It seems like a good time to stop because my screen has gone blank anyway. So what I will do here is I will stop the video and I'll put my camera back on if I can.
Yeah, Leslie.
So you're not having me yelling at the screen. Maybe try and leave the nice landscape up if the bandwidth will allow it.
Awesome. Right. Thank you, Leslie. That was a really interesting talk. As you can see at the bottom of your screen, there have been a couple of questions submitted.
Okay.
So the first one that came in was, does the remaining radioactivity influence the safety of consuming fish on the Fukushima coast?
That's a really good question. What I will say is that the monitoring and screening processes they have are such that fish are not released for consumption until there is very high certainty that the levels of radiation will not be harmful. So there's a few steps that are taken to make that happen. One is that the maximum allowable level of radioactive cesium is 50 becquerels per kilogram. That's in comparison to the Japanese standard of 100 and the UK standard of about the EU standard of about 1,200. So from a precautionary basis, they have a very low threshold for allowing things to be sold. There's also a two-stage process, one of monitoring the fish before they're even considered, and then of continuing screening after they're released for the market. So there's pretty good knowledge and consensus that anything that's actually released for sale is not going to be harmful.
Okay, awesome. Our second question that came in was, to what extent is specific pride in eating locally caught fish orchestrated or spontaneous? If orchestrated as a campaign, who led this?
Again, great question, and my answer would be a bit of both. There's an issue that anything that is orchestrated tends to be viewed with a great deal of skepticism by the Japanese public, and increasingly so. So there's a really funny thread on Twitter if you find this, and Prime Minister Abe, his campaign team have got a big thing about him eating produce. So whenever there's an election coming up, you see him, he goes places and he eats the local food. He's done this in Fukushima too. He comes and he eats the peaches, he eats the fish. People that like Abe like this, people that don't become very suspicious. So there are orchestrated campaigns from the national government, from the regional government, and the local government to encourage people to consume fish, but these are met with a mixture of support and skepticism. What have been more successful have been some of the initiatives that have been led from the ground up. For example, there's a lot of hashtags that run about citizens interested in produce. Started things like food terrorism is one, delicious Fukushima is another, and then these are more sort of grassroots. These are less orchestrated, and these are more sort of organic. There's an NGO as well, Umi Labo, which was founded by a group of citizens who just enjoy eating the fish, and they started doing monitoring. So orchestrated, but it's the ground up ones that are effective.
Okay. I've just cut your camera, Leslie, just to try and save on the bandwidth, just because you're cutting out occasionally. Hopefully that will be rectified.
Okay. I just hope it wasn't the Japanese government hacking me for criticising the Prime Minister.
Yeah, maybe. We'll see. So the next question that came in was saying about how the fishers perceive themselves as it relates to the perceived quality of their product. That some of the products will be perceived as contaminated, or at least by the rest of the country, this seemed to be borne out by the local campaign for locally landed fish. That would be reaction against a normal national perception and perhaps a local perception. Is there any suggestion that a reduction in the perception of quality of what they catch is changing how the fishers feel about their occupation and maybe their own identity?
That's a great question, and I will try and do it justice in a short space of time. I think one of the things that fishers in Fukushima have felt quite hard done by is that there's a very clear geographical distinction that's been made between Fukushima fish and fish from the rest of Japan. And it was pointed out to me a few years ago when we talked to a group of fishers that you can have a fishing port right in the south of Fukushima where they're not allowed to fish at full scale, and just 2-3 miles south in another prefecture you've got another port where fishers are able to fish freely. And I think that the fishers quite understandably think that that's very unfair, because as was pointed out to us, fish don't respect geographical boundaries. There's nothing to say that a fish swimming a few miles south is not going to have been swimming up near the nuclear plant. And so I think one of the things that the fishers and indeed the cooperatives and the brokers have found really tough has been just this clear binary that's been made between Fukushima fish versus rest of northeast Japan fish. That has partly been borne out exactly as the question said. That's partly been borne out in the way that they try and really emphasize the quality of the fish in their branding. Interestingly, this Joban Mono campaign that I talked about, the one that's with the little blue, white and red flags, they've really kind of emphasized that the ocean currents and the way the nutrients mix mean that this is actually better water for fish than elsewhere. So they've tried to sort of kind of fight back as such against this perception somehow that the fish is lower quality. As to whether fishers think that makes their work more or less valuable, that I'm not so sure about. I mean, when we talked to them, they still seemed quite proud of what they did, and indeed there was a group of gillnet fishers who said to us, we weren't allowed to eat Fukushima fish for a few years because it was banned. We now eat them again, and we now realise how delicious they are because we haven't been able to eat them for a while. So they themselves sort of feel that they catch good fish, they catch good quality fish, and they want people to be able to eat these. So there are definitely issues that go on there around association with place and association with identity and around work. It's a great question, and I hope I've answered it well.
Oh, that's really good. Next question says, it's quite interesting to see what the coping strategies are given a shock to a system. I guess in some cases turning it into agriculture and other jobs is more feasible, but maybe not in this case. They say, I don't know if relevant, but what do you think the current pandemic crisis would do to the fishermen and their communities, and possibly to the entire seafood chain in the short and long term?
That's, again, a great question. I'll try and answer it as best I can. One of the things, first of all, is in terms of the population, the demographic of fishers is very old. And so most fishers in Fukushima are in their 60s, 70s, and indeed in their 80s. So, they are at a high risk group. It is equally also the case that the coast is quite sparsely populated, so people are quite far apart. And that doesn't mean to say that it's not an issue, but I think the risk of transmission is perhaps not as great as it might be in a denser space. But it certainly has a potential to impact upon fishing and on fishing practices. For seafood and distribution more widely, this has become a bit of a hot topic in Japan, because now let's see if my signal cuts out again. Prime Minister Abe announced last week that they were going to introduce vouchers for consumers for domestic, I believe, beef and I think fish to stimulate the economy during the coronavirus crisis and to encourage people to eat domestic produce. So there was a big effort to try and offset any negative effects that might arise from that. Whether that's successful or not, I don't know, but it certainly has potential to disrupt fishing activities, and indeed to put fishers themselves at risk. Whether then we can look at the food vouchers as being the latest in a long number of ways in which the Japanese state has sought to continue subsidising Fukushima fish is one way of thinking about it. But again, great question, thank you.
Yeah, I can confirm you were all clear through that, so that was
Good.
fun. The next series of questions came from Chris. So his first question is there any contamination getting locked away in the seabed sediments and therefore at risk of being released?
Okay. The short answer to that is I'm not a natural scientist, but I do collaborate with institutes who are involved in monitoring. They do take samples regularly from the seabed and from sediments, and they haven't found large levels of contaminants, but that's not to say that they're not keeping an eye on this. So there's nothing that's an immediate threat as a result of that, as far as I understand.
Mm-hmm. Their second question was, has agricultural production on local land also been affected by contamination, and how does the response from farmers compare to fishers?
Okay, so agriculture has been affected as well. I think what makes it easier with agriculture is you don't have ocean currents. So you have the radiation, radioactive contamination goes out, and generally we have a fairly good idea of where it is. And okay, you get into things about the complexities of ecosystems and water courses and things, but by and large, from a pretty early stage, the authorities, the farmers themselves, had a pretty good idea of where the areas of high contamination were. And indeed, the closer you get to the nuclear plant, the more work has had to go into remediating the soil. They're now at a stage where they can grow rice again for consumption on land up to about 5 kilometres away from the nuclear plant. So, for example, last night for my dinner, I had rice that came from Tomioka, which is 5 miles south of the Fukushima plant. So I think what has made fishing a bit more complex in this regard is that you have these ocean currents, and indeed, you know, the rate at which species have been released is not as straightforward as being the ones that are closer to the plant versus the ones that are further away. So there are parallels, but I think the marine environment adds extra complexity.
Their final question was, do you eat fish when you're there?
Yes, in fact, so it's quite well known that most Scottish people, when they go to Japan, lose weight. I actually put weight on. I came back 3 kilograms heavier. And there is, again, there's a point there I say this humorously, but there's a point I do want to flag up there about kind of the ethics of doing this research. And, you know, I don't want to become like an uncritical campaigner for Fukushima seafood, but when we go there, especially when we're using public funds, as far as possible, we try to ensure that travel subsistence money goes back into the local economy, whether it's, you know, eating in independent restaurants, supporting independent hotel chains and all the rest, trying to kind of make sure that that money goes back into the communities and people that have supported us with doing the field work. So absolutely, yes, I do eat the fish that's there, but equally, I don't force it upon others. And I'd like to think I try to respect that everybody makes their own decision on whether they wish to consume or not based on their own context.
Yeah. Just noticing the time, we've just got a couple more questions to answer. So we'll just go through those. If anyone else has any more questions, they can email Leslie or at least let MASTS know, and we can organise that to be answered later. So the next question was, Leslie, you mentioned at the end of overfishing. So I wondered, what was the status of the stocks in the area? 9 years of no fishing are more than enough to re-establish the stock status, unless obviously the radiation haven't increased the mortality and altered the reproduction cycle. Are you aware of studies that reported this type of biological modification? did the fishermen you interviewed observe a difference in the quality and quantity of their catches?
That's the reason I put up overfishing in the final slide is it goes exactly to the last part of that question. So again, the young fishers in particular, so we talked to the young fishers, and they said, you know, the fishing stopped for 4 or 5 years. We went back out, and they said we were amazed how many fish were coming in the nets. And for the younger fishers, they realised very quickly, you know, oh my goodness, we've really been overfishing here. And they said to us, you know, it was a very clear sign of just the extent of the effect that fishing has had on the coastal environment. Nonetheless, the stocks are declining pretty quickly again, particularly a bit further out to sea, because you have some big trawlers that do deeper sea fishing off the Fukushima coast, and already fishers are saying they're finding it harder to find certain types of fish. Also, with climate change as well, they are starting to see different things in their bycatch. So they're seeing different fish coming in the nets that they haven't seen before, fish that they would expect to find in warmer waters that they're starting to see. So, you know, a lot of this is anecdotally getting picked up. If you want to look at some of the underpinning science, the Fukushima Prefecture, the experimental research station, the Fisheries research station, they've published quite a bit on this. Toshihiro Wada is the name of the guy, and I'm happy to pass on details after via email. They've looked at some of the underpinning science, but certainly anecdotally, the younger fishers have been seeing overfishing, and even now, you know, the effects of climate change as well are anecdotally starting to be reported.
Interesting. And our final question is about the low numbers of women involved in these conversations. Has there been, or will there be, any plans to make these meetings more inclusive?
From a research point of view, absolutely. And I think for the kind of the research design from now into the future, the hope is that we can do that in a way that is going to get a broader range of voices, and also, but also is, I suppose, culturally sensitive. And we're hoping to work with Kawabe Sensei's lab with her group to think about how we might access and engage with some of these voices. In terms of how that influences decision making, that's quite difficult, and I want to be careful and diplomatic how I phrase this, because I don't want to be criticizing another society and culture from the outside, but it's still quite common in Japan to have all male panels. You know, you'll see academic events and things in the posters, and there'll just be a lineup of men, and there's not really the same level of, and I don't want to impose my own opinion from the outside, but there isn't the same sort of awareness that one might see around these gender differences. So that's something we want to think through a bit more. We did ask the Fisheries, the regional government extension officers, I asked them, you know, have you given any thought to the different experiences of the different ways in which men and women might experience post-disaster fisheries differently? And they were quite honest, and they said it's not something we've thought about, but you know, it's something that we do want to look at more going forwards. So from a research point of view, yes, absolutely, it's something we want to kind of hardwire into the research design. From a practical point of view, it's kind of trying to make incremental progress.
Excellent. Right. We have no more questions to answer, and we have gone slightly over time. So all I need to say is thank you, Leslie, for being our first MASTS webinar presenter. We had a great turnout, and as I've just popped onto everyone else's screens, we have future webinars coming up. If you would like to register and attend those, just use the same link that you've done before. There might be some more dates and speakers coming up. Yeah, that was a really great talk, and thank you again, Leslie.
Thank you.